term terrorism refers to the use of violence to create a climate of fear for political ends. The term is controversial for a number of reasons, not least because it's typically used to refer only to non-state actors, thus serving to legitimize the use of violence by states and delegitimize its use by others. Nevertheless, the massive rise in deaths at the hands of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda over the past 6 years has led many to conclude that terrorism, even when narrowly defined as non-state terrorism, is indeed a major threat to global security. I will argue, however, that the major threat to global security is state terror, which not only kills more people than terrorism, but by destabilizing states such as Iraq, Syria, Libya and Yemen, creates the conditions for non-state terrorism to thrive as well. One reason terrorism is viewed as a major threat is due to its massive destructive potential. This was demonstrated by the September 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in the USA, the symbols of American economic and military power. These attacks heralded a new era of what Hayward has dubbed catastrophic terrorism, involving mass civilian casualties. The huge death toll from this attack, which produced almost 3,000 fatalities, and the fact that it struck at the heart of the world's strongest power, the US, demonstrated that no one is safe from the so-called new terrorism led by Al-Qaeda. Indeed, the availability of nuclear materials on the open market following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 has led some to speculate that even a nuclear terror attack might not be impossible. George Bush Jr., for example, raised the possibility of a doomsday scenario, whereby a rogue state such as Iraq or North Korea develops a nuclear weapon and delivers it into the hands of terrorists. Likewise, Allison, 2004, argued that such an attack is inevitable unless there is a global lockdown of nuclear materials. It is precisely this massive destructive capacity that has led some to argue that terrorism is now the major threat facing the world. Furthermore, terrorist attacks are almost impossible to prevent. Recent attacks in London, in Westminster, London Bridge and Finsbury Park have managed to cause dozens of casualties simply using vans and knives. Likewise, one single attack in Nice in July 2016 managed to kill 86 people simply by driving a truck along a crowded road. Preventing attacks such as these is almost impossible, as they can be carried out by anyone without any sophisticated equipment or training whatsoever. Furthermore, deterrence doesn't work against such attacks. Firstly, if perpetrators are willing to give up their lives, as they seem to be in many of the recent suicide attacks, the threat of harsh punishments is meaningless. Secondly, with individuals and non-state groups responsible for attacks, there is no state against which to threaten retaliation. The Cold War doctrine of MAD, mutually assured destruction, is irrelevant here, as even the most advanced nuclear weapons will not deter an individual bent on destruction. And finally, even the most intense state security measures do not appear to be able to prevent attacks from taking place. Following the Charlie Hebdo and Bataclan attacks in Paris in 2015, a state of emergency was announced, legalizing an unprecedented suspension of civil liberties. Yet even this did not prevent the Nice attack from taking place the following year. The relative ease with which such attacks can be carried out renders their total prevention simply impossible, suggesting that terrorism is indeed a major threat to global security. Furthermore, this threat is exacerbated, some argue, by the ideological nature of the so-called new terrorism. Unlike the more nationalistic militias of the past, such as the IRA and the ANC, the fundamentalist jihadi groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS have a global ideology aiming for nothing less than the creation of a worldwide Islamic caliphate. The uncompromising universalism of this ideology makes it virtually impossible to consider negotiations and political deals with its advocates. The kind of political settlements reached in Northern Ireland and South Africa therefore seem highly unfeasible in the case of groups such as ISIS. Another difference between the new terrorism and the old, which makes it more of a threat, is the fact that groups such as ISIS have no moral qualms about inflicting mass civilian casualties. While the IRA and ANC went to great lengths to try to avoid innocent lives being lost, giving the police advance warnings of their bombs, for example, to give the authorities time to clear the buildings, ISIS actually aimed to inflict as many civilian casualties as possible. This deliberate targeting of civilians, along with the universalist aims of the new terrorism, all add weight to the claim that new terrorism is indeed a major threat to global security. Finally, it is claimed that the global reach of the new terrorism makes it a major threat. Al-Qaeda and ISIS appear to have cells or affiliates in almost every country in the world, and have carried out major attacks in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Indonesia, Cameroon, Belgium, France, the USA, Spain, Mali, Tunisia, Algeria, and many other places. Even previously stable countries, such as Iran and the UK, have recently been rocked by major attacks, including a string of 3 in the last 3 months in the UK. ISIS and Al-Qaeda or their affiliates now control territory in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Nigeria, and Somalia. And deaths by terrorism, according to the Global Terrorism Index, now average around 80 per day. This global reach dates back to the mid-1990s, when Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden announced a shift in the group's focus from what he called the near enemy, the corrupt Arab leaders of the Middle East, to the far enemy, the Western states such as the US who support these corrupt leaders. Accompanying this shift in ideology, groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have also been able to take advantage of increasing globalization in 2 main ways. Firstly, they've been able to use increased cross-border flows of people, money, technology, goods, to enhance their access to fighters, weaponry, and finance. Secondly, globalization has led to a backlash against perceived Western cultural imperialism, which militant Islamic groups have been able to tap into and exploit. However, it is the West itself which has particularly facilitated the global reach of the new terrorism through its wars in the Middle East. Wars waged or funded by the West have turned countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Yemen into virtually failed states, which have in turn become safe havens for terrorist groups from across the region. NATO's war in Libya in 2011, for example, has greatly strengthened the Nigerian ISIS affiliate Boko Haram by providing it with access to training facilities and weapons from Libya. Thus, the global reach of the new terrorism, facilitated both by globalization and military intervention, also make it a major threat to global security. Arguing against the threat of terrorism, some critical theorists have argued that the threat of terrorism has been exaggerated. The destruction caused by terrorism can only ever be sporadic, they argue, nothing like the sustained and systematic destruction of state-led warfare. Very few terror attacks kill over 100 people. Up until 2010, there had only been 20 attacks since 1968 with more than 100 fatalities, whilst war kills an average of 5 times that number every day. Indeed, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945 killed 200,000, almost 70 times the number killed by the 9/11 attacks, whilst the Battle of the Somme, one single battle during the First World War, killed 1.5 million people. Indeed, the war on terror itself is estimated to have killed between 1.3 and 2 million people since it began in 2001. Thinkers such as Noam Chomsky have argued that the so-called state terrorism of warfare is far more devastating than the terrorism of non-state actors such as ISIS, suggesting that terrorism, as commonly understood, is far less of a threat than conventional warfare. Furthermore, there are far bigger killers than either war or terrorism. The 80 per day killed by terrorism and the 500 per day killed by war are both dwarfed by the 1,300 per day killed by malnutrition, the 1,500 per day killed in civilian homicides, the 2,000 per day killed by suicide, and the 3,000 per day killed in traffic accidents. As Charles Kurtzman has put it, quote, "Terrorism is not a leading cause of death in the world. If we want to save lives, far more would be saved by diverting a small portion of the world's counter-terrorism budgets towards mosquito netting." Others have argued that whilst terrorism may well be a threat, it is a threat to specific countries rather than to global security as such. In countries already embroiled in political instability and civil conflict, such as Libya, Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, and Nigeria, terrorism is indeed a major security threat. Yet this is because it is a response to specific destabilizing conditions unique to those countries. Whilst countries such as the UK and US may find themselves victims of attacks from time to time, these represent tragedies for the families involved, rather than genuine threats to the political stability of the nation. Indeed, historically, Armed non-state groups have only ever achieved their goals where they have defended the interests of entire national groups. Thus the IRA and ANC were able to gain some success due to their popular support amongst the oppressed Catholic and black communities they represented. The so-called new terrorists of ISIS and Al-Qaeda will never have these levels of mass support due to the extreme and sectarian nature of their politics, rejected by the vast majority of those they claim to represent. Indeed, their methods are counterproductive, producing outrage, hostility, and military retaliation. This suggests they will never achieve their goals, and are therefore less of a threat to global security than is often made out. Finally, it has been argued that the terrorist threat has been exaggerated for ideological purposes. The so-called war on terror, according to this view, is an ideological construct designed to provide the West with a new enemy in the absence of the old communist threat. This new enemy provides the West with an identity as valiant freedom fighters struggling for freedom and democracy against Islamic totalitarianism. But it also provides them with a pretext for ever-increasing military spending and interventions. According to this view, the fear of so-called Islamist terrorism that is promoted in the West is based on false assumptions about a clash of civilizations. These assumptions are false in that they presuppose irreconcilable differences between Islamic and Western civilizations, when the reality is that many supposedly Western values, such as democracy, tolerance, and the rule of law, in fact have rather longer and more distinguished histories in the Islamic world than they do in Europe. In this view, terrorism is portrayed as a major threat not because it really is one, but to serve the ideological needs of the West and its military-industrial complex. In conclusion, terrorism, in the narrow sense of political violence perpetrated by non-state actors, is a very real threat, but not to global security, rather to specific countries such as Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria. For the inhabitants of these countries, the threat is certainly real, and is experienced in mass civilian casualties on an almost daily basis.